Hi, listeners. So, for those who stick with us, we've officially turned into the podcast. It's called Machining Beyond the Craft. So, we're talking about business with shop operators, with machinists, and just people that experts in manufacturing. And today I have my good friend Drura Parrish on the pod. Hi, Drura. How are you?
Hey, how's it going? How's life?
Very good.
Again, I asked you again. Is it still good? 8 out of 10?
It's still good after a couple of minutes. Still feels good.
Okay,
So,
good.
yeah. So I believe the only thing that crazier than starting your first business is starting your second one. So how's your new venture?
It's good, and it's part of a lifelong dedication to the same problem. So it's a natural extension. And so, do you want to know what that problem is?
Absolutely.
So, as a kid, I was obsessed with the idea of thinking and making being the same thing. That I grew up in a manufacturing family, and I grew up like a machine shop rat, and I grew up in an environment where, people were constantly like, a thought would come to their head, and then they would go and make it. But the labor of that was always very apparent. The last company, actually 2 companies ago, I owned my own machine shop. And then the last company was MakeTime and then Xometry, where, we made on-demand manufacturing stuff. And now, like, when you think about thinking and making being the same thing, right? Like, the first thing that comes to mind is, like, super, like, 9th century technology, but that's not the case. Like, what we first need to do is first thing that people need to do is prove that you can prototype anything. Then you need to prove that you can make anything at scale. And when we were at MakeTime and Xometry, the core team here, we realized that one of the biggest problems with scaling in machine shops and manufacturers is like the freeing up of cash to be able to invest back in your shop to do the things that you need to do to automate. And so you start thinking about like all the functions around making things, and one of those is purchasing stuff. And so you think about like a shop owner or even a purchasing agent at a larger company, how much time they spend in just trying to find a better deal or the item that's available. And I can't tell you, like, just, when I was with MakeTime and Xometry and all our machine shops, how many times I'd go into a shop and I would see the shop owner with 1,000 tabs open in his browser for like Granger, McMaster-Carr, like MSC, like Fastenal, all the companies like Blackhawk, just trying to find this just 10-cent savings. And so back to like thinking and making, I was like, well, we're never going to be able to cross the threshold of like full automation unless we also start looking at front office problems, right? Like, this more than anybody, like quoting and how difficult, like how much time people spend, but just like, in America, like the shrinking of the front office because of rising costs on the backside of a shop is a problem. And so like what needs to happen is increased amount of automation, like in accounting, like quotation, like just simple things like who the hell is going to send the stamped envelope, like who's going to put the stamp on the envelope to send out the bills, all the way to purchasing. So the new company is just all about that, just automating one part of the front office problem, which is purchasing, so that those people can do more things that are like value add for the company, as well as like hopefully save a few bucks along the way.
So it looks like we are in agreement that one of the biggest problems that I'm again noticing here in the US is it's a lot of the unnecessary, I can't say unnecessary people, of course, but it's just a lot of the unnecessary movements in the companies, and also, of course, some sort of the overhiring that's happening. And it led to things when, again, just, multiple persons do the one thing that can be done by either just one person or, just with the software, with the automation, stuff like that. So do you see it's happening a lot, and do you think it is something that will change with automation? Because again, it's obviously will lead to some other problem. I don't know if we want to touch that, as the just as a problem of the unemployment then that will happen, of course, eventually, because again, if you don't have a work for all the people, you need to have a solution for them, of course. So what do you think? What do you think the future brings us? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard question. Like I always go back to my roots. Like, my grandfather who started the manufacturing company that my family runs, they believed it was their job to hire as many people as they could locally the minute they tasted any success to give back to the community. I think there's like, a hidden altruism, like in specifically like a lot of rural based businesses too, that like people feel like that, you should give back. I do think that, and then I think about like historically, once again, when I was at Xometry, we had a supplies business for a while. And so I moved headlong into distribution, and somebody said, why there's so many salespeople in industrial distributors? And it's like, I have no idea why. And the guy said, after World War II, they busted up a bunch of monopolies and created a lot of distributorships in order to hire all the returning troops. So it was a response to opening up a labor pool problem, right, on one side of the coin for industrial companies. So I think also, there's a fear in, going deep sometimes outside of like, let's put it this way, I feel like outside of machining or making, the emphasis on what somebody does in a shop a lot of times can be devalued. So what happens is they end up putting more people on the task in a shallower rate than a deeper rate. Whereas a machinist is a machinist, and they're going to be tending the machine and making sure that everything goes well, because that's where the center of cost is. But I think in a lot of other areas, people are just like, just hire cheaper labor to do more things less efficiently than if there was an investment towards software automation and more education, quite bluntly, for the use of that software. In Kentucky, where we are, there's a lot of emphasis on training at the vocational level and high school levels, giving people like what they call Navy SEAL level skills in the shop, where they have to be able to tend the machine, go over, run QuickBooks, do all the things. Like they're training owners of the future, as they say. And so I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. And I do think that it's inevitable that economics are going to force us to automate more, both in the front office and on the machine floor. And I don't know. I don't think it's going to adversely affect. I'm one of the people where I think that like, the more automation and more robotics are introduced to this world, I think there's going to be more need for expertise in like expanding in other technologies that are going to take us to the 3rd century, right? Like the minute we get one American machine shop all roboted up, it's the minute we're going to have holodecks. You know what I mean? It's like that's kind of the next fucking thing, that we're going to be going to. So it excites me, like in that, and I think that. I think another thing that sneaks up in here is like the apprenticeship culture, like where, people feel like they need to learn everything about a place. This lends to the shallow problem, not the deep problem, more than anything. But ultimately, I'm, going back to just the core question, I'm hopeful that we will automate more and that America will create more ambidextrous, like owner-operators for that automation, so that we will start actually implementing and inventing even crazier, shop floor stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thinking about that from the same perspective, especially with the machine shops, because they don't have this sort of the luxury when they, can, raise a bunch of capital and go, hire or overhire, people, of course. So, of course, like it might be an option to just run it on a different business model, for example, like sharing profits, or basically giving ownership to pretty much everyone at the shop, and maybe that's the solution. Because again, like at the end of the day, of course, like it's extremely hard to with the level of the wages that we have now, it's extremely hard to motivate people to to start working at the machine shop, unless they just extremely passionate about that. And of course, maybe in their early career they just need to get experience, which is, of course, I think it's the best way to get some experience, just working in a shop. But at the same time, like from the perspective of scaling this as a business, it looks like that maybe the beneficiaries of the of this, well, I would hope call it like manufacturing boom in America. Maybe the beneficiaries going to be those who basically combining software and hardware, some automation software and hardware, because it's not on a pure machining level. I mean, a lot of the shops do very similar things using very similar equipment, very similar tools and things like that. But of course, when you're adding some additional components like automation, like software, so you have a chances to, again, to make it more, let's say, innovative business model or whatever. So that's the one way. But second way, I think, and again, I heard, of course, about the many examples where owners basically share the profits, share the ownership with the employees, with machine shop. So do you think, is this one of the way, or maybe you see like some alternative to that?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think the core problem lies in the word profit, right? And I think one of the real issues here is that with the increase of demand that we're seeing, like on American machine shops and manufacturers, I'm not sure why the cost curve isn't going down on the supply side. Like if you look at a lot of the numbers, like there's been very little relief like on material. There's been very little relief like on like your base supplies, fasteners, cutting tools, etc. And so like no matter how much work you get, the American machine shop's profit margins still suck. And manufacturers like just aren't fantastic. And it's not that like there aren't breakout success stories and there's, people going lights out and stuff like that, but for the most part, it's not, like if you drive around just Kentucky where there's, a gazillion machine shops, it's not, you're not seeing like a Porsche 911 in every driveway or like a big, like GMC Denali or whatever the nicest car is. It's like people are just still struggling to make a living. And that's the question that I always ask. What is the real core problem? Is it a COGS problem? Is it the cost of goods? And what they're doing, is it because they're like materials operates, as one lump commodity and like there's very little negotiation against it, and like, so what are all these factors? And I just think about, just look at the pure scale of the goods that America produces, and why isn't it more possible for us to generate a greater profit out of it? So that's the first question. Second question, once you generate more profit, I think absolutely like, alternative modes of ownership, ESOPs and, employee-owned businesses. And, there's a great company here in Kentucky called Houchins, which is an employee-owned company, conglomerate that set the bar high, an example, a couple decades back. But I still think like, okay, so that's great, but first we got to get the profit. And we have to get to the point that like, most of these companies are multi-generational and there's like all kinds of tax issues and the handover of these multi-generational businesses. And, our family's business, like back in, the 80s and 90s, almost like got tanked just because of like generational handover. And so there's all these like things at play, and we say that it's just such a vital part of the American fabric, but there's very little relief. Mm-hmm. So we solve that part, and then I think we open up to like, sure, like more profit, then there's going to be more investment. Then it's going to make more sense. Like, EBITDA goes up, and then you're going to have more private equity plays like on smaller manufacturing companies and roll-ups. You get more roll-ups, and, let's just say the more automation comes through and the more proprietary like manufacturing floor setups that we have, the more IP we generate, the more the front end capital like venture starts to exist and make it like a viable opportunity too. So I think it's just an overwhelmingly complex thing of what ownership is. But like I said, just let's go back to like, how do we get relief to the manufacturers? And like this, like I said, it's much money that passes through. Just like American machine shops, like if it's 36 billion, 100 billion, whatever numbers you're looking at, like if you're looking at like, manufacturing and the trillion plus that it's like generating, it's just like still like it comes down to like hair thin margins, like for these guys. So it's complicated.
Yeah. And that led me to other questions. So again, because you've been in the industry for 10 I don't think it's 10 years. Okay, so you launched MakeTime in 2014, right? So, but you've been in the industry
Yeah.
forever, basically.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, what's real changes do you see that happened, especially because the agenda when you started was, at least partially or maybe entirely, is to basically digitizing legacy industry. So, do you think, or do you see the changes for machine shop on kind of on the ground level that happening because of the rise of the tools like MakeTime, like Xometry and others? And if you see those changes, so what exactly changes you actually can?
The craziest change that I've seen is, going. I was at a machine shop. This was after Xometry, after I exited Xometry. And I was in a machine shop in the middle of nowhere, and the owner was sitting in a gaming chair. He had 6 monitors up. He had his CAD on one side. In the middle, he had the Xometry job board on one, and then he had some security cameras on the other. And I was just thinking, that is totally different. That job workflow started becoming ubiquitous to the overall flow of the environment. Whereas, back in the day, I mean, these are obvious things. Like back in the day, and you're at the front of this. It's like, you just prayed to God that a manufacturing rep would bring you some work, and they would bring you like something garbage and charge you like 80%, like of whatever the gross margin was or the net, whatever they decided it was. So that's one thing. Like, and then I'd say just like on the demand side, I think there's more of a sense that anything can get done. I think you can see this like on the defense spend now, right? Before, like, you didn't know what the capacity or the capabilities of like the manufacturers in the United States were.
Yeah.
And like now all of a sudden you upload like some crazy specialized like war thing and you get a quote on it, or like you've got like the next laser cannon. There's somebody like there's enough hunger on the broker side, like meaning like the Xometries of the world, Fictives, etc., that like not everybody's going to say no. You're going to get a yes.
Mm-hmm.
Before it was a lot of no's, and it was a lot of no's because like you were just dealing with whoever had enough money to surface themselves. So the redistribution of capital from the richest top 5% of small manufacturers or machine shops down across the board, I think was one of the most significant shifts that we've probably seen in the past 10 years. Because then you'd get, like in the case of like a Xometry or Protolabs, publicly traded, cash and marketing budgets to say, no, like for real, like we can injection mold that, no problem. Like, yeah, you want to build a car? Like, and I remember seeing like our early adopters, like, they were startups, they were technology companies, they were the people that always got told no. Like, and they were like biomed device companies, like making really weird shit. And like, you just like, you would see these CAD files coming across and you just really got the feeling that like the real shift is not so much like in shop mentality, what was happening, but just like what the demand saw. And it was a very romantic, like time to be a part of that. And, now like you've got, as a result, because the higher the variation in the workflow and, let's say the high mix, low volume kind of runs that are going through shops, people are equipping their shops to handle it more. Like, so, quick change. You've got like, I'm seeing, the other major shifts are like, greater, one operator over a greater breadth of machines, like, just working on high mix stuff. You're seeing like shops that like otherwise would have never done like Inconel, like now doing Inconel, like it's just like random weird things, not like the roboticized future that you would think, but just like people positioning to take variable work and not just wait for home runs.
Yeah.
Because forever American machine shops and small manufacturers were just trained to sit and wait for like GE to call and just hope that they were going to get that once again from the manufacturing rep. So very interesting, like, and all that, like in the course of a decade, like I said, primarily just from that, shift in spend, it's been phenomenal to watch. Yeah. It's just been like great to watch. And like, I remember the MakeTime dream was just like to keep the lights on for one more month was kind of like our first rally call. And like now there's enough work where if you're a good enough supplier, then like if you're hitting a hard stretch, then you're going to be able to do that. And that's a great
Yeah.
thing to see.
I really like the thing about redistribution, of course, because again, it allow more players to get into the space, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing with, as you said, like a lot of the buyers previously just get no. So no, we don't want to produce your whatever you like building in your hardware startups, whatever. So like basically go to China and like mold it or get the part. But now, I mean, a lot of the shops, of course, specialized on those maybe sometimes just even very niche spaces. Like again, we talked about like go-kart, like farming equipment, and just bunch of other stuff, of course.
Yeah.
So basically creating more, well, I mean, machine shops become more accessible for the buyers, and the buyers basically just expect from machine shops, like again, if I want to machine something, I can easily find it here in US.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to actually now thinking about how logistically and from the language perspective I'm going to approach some overseas machine shop or injection molding company to explain them what exactly I want to do, and of course get the part with all the logistics involved, like language barrier and stuff like that. So the interesting part for me specifically, and again, retrospectively, seeing that what happened in the last 10 years, it's actually a big shift. It's actually a big shift that now feels almost as a normal. Like, thing that we see now from the, not only just Xometry and others, but just like regular machine shops with instant quoting, with the front end, with the customer front experience, it's normalized. It's normalized, and it was only my dream like 8-10 years ago. Just the dream that you would never think it's possible. Yes, it took like 10 years, but it's still, it
happened. And we're here, making the weirdest stuff on the face of the planet, which is great.
Very true, very true. Yeah, so talking about your current company, Purchaser. So again, a lot of the debates in the world of startups, of course, in regards, should I go and raise VC funding or should I bootstrap? And again, obviously, there's a lot of the reasons why to go and raise VC money, and also like whether or not your exact business model and your exact company is really best fit for VC money or not. But in your opinion, again, because we're talking about a very specific field, which is manufacturing, and it's really special. It's not, let's call it, it's not average software or hardware type of the industry. It's really special. So what's your take on that, whether or not, or in what cases, go and raise VC funding versus do bootstrap?
So you're talking about just startups in particular, right?
Startups in manufacturing.
Startups in there you go. I'm just realizing that me sitting in front of this wall is a very weird picture. Like I feel like Han Solo stuck after Jabba. So there's no right answer to that question. I'll just say that I've always admired, I always admire anybody wanting to make software for manufacturing because it is the most thankless space to create anything. And that's because everything around it is so critical and time, reactive and like necessary. So there's just no time to F around. And so what that means is, and I think we've discussed this before, there's no such thing as like a go-to-market strategy. I don't care what anybody says in any manufacturing startup, because nobody has time to listen. Nobody has time to listen. You can't blame them either. So what you run into is like the most visceral, most immediate product market fit feeling is what you get in this space if it's right. And so I think it rewards product or bootstrap companies because you know if your product is good and if you can sustain. If you live longer than 8 years in this world or 6 years, no matter what your scale is, you've made something that is vital and maybe that just drops in the channel. I think where bootstrap versus VC in this space comes down to one thing, which is your customer acquisition costs and how you can get that market, because it is ridiculously hard and high. And so you can have the best product in the world, but in order to get out in front of these customers, you have to be militarized in terms of the money that you're willing to spend. This is something that we learned big time in our last go round. There's, two different methodologies of marketplace spend with MakeTime and Xometry. Xometry's approach was obviously much better and much more focused. But the reason why I bring this up is it's hard to bootstrap a startup when your customer acquisition costs could realistically be in the thousands of dollars, because you're not going to realize those returns in a timely manner, and you won't be able to understand your LTV in enough time when your sales cycles are 120 days and greater. So all these things come together, and then conversely, you have the same problem in the venture world, because they're like, we need to see we got to grow 30% month over month. You're like, well, no, you can't. That could be compounded at the end of the year, because there's so much to be had in manufacturing. You really run into the same, the venture path, I think, is a necessary path, and it's starting to open up a little bit more. And I think people are starting to understand the curves a little bit more, to make it more approachable to raise money. I remember, I tell the story all the time, we got told no 266 times for MakeTime, and I got told yes twice. And just this time around with Purchaser, those dynamics were fundamentally different. Okay. For a lot of reasons, but yeah. I think primarily because a lot of the market and venture has shifted to understand that this is vital. I remember pitching no, it's important because you wouldn't have a car without it. Just dumb stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so, but back to the bootstrap side of things is I think it works best if you get an immediate signal on your product. Then there's your risk curve goes down significantly on acquisition, and you can start doing that. Whereas a lot of the venture-backed companies are oscillating wildly through. I think one, disclaimer here too is that the, ideal customer profiles, there's people lump manufacturing into one big puddle of crap as far as what a customer is defined as. They even lump machine shops into one big lump. And as well as I do, that a machine shop, there could be a diversity of customers of hundreds of segments, hundreds of profiles. They could be biomed only, and they have crazy SAML SOC 2, CMMC, or defense, ITAR, DFARS, whatever, that just disallow you to even get near them. And then all this crazy stuff. So paying to go through those, as smart as we think we are, in being able to identify these segments, oftentimes you have to burn some cash just to figure it out, and you just can't bootstrap that. You just can't do it. So when picking the path, if you get if you just throw a dart and you get the right customer, and you get the right product feedback, and it is and you're able to run a pretty successful and moderated sales marketing campaign, then why not? Yeah. But on the flip side, venture is designed to do one thing, and that's to maximize the amount of money and value to be extracted from a company over its lifespan. Mm-hmm. It's hard to emulate that model in bootstrap. If you think about, venture is connected to LPs, to banking, to markets, and it's designed to shuffle people along. Yeah. So, growth is inherent there. It doesn't mean you can't do it bootstrap, but the path is different and, oftentimes slower, just because the network coefficient, of what venture can bring to the table. And it doesn't always, you have to be a good company for any of it to work on both sides. But, there's just time, the time value of money, bootstrap, a lot of the bootstrap argument is you get to maintain and maximize more. And then a lot of the VC thing is it doesn't matter if you have less because it's going to be worth more. There's just 1,000 gazillion arguments on both sides. But I do think now more than ever, venture is looking very good for manufacturing startups, because the same reason why it looked good for B2B SaaS, right? Because those sales cycles are long too. And
Yeah.
I think we're finally, both sides, the manufacturing startup and the manufacturing startup investors, are seeing exactly what's at stake and what the time component of what is at stake as well.
So, do you think that, because again, something that I also seeing as a change among the VCs, I mean, first, many of them finally understand that manufacturing is not just one thing, one whole thing. It's it's slightly more complex, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first. But secondly, more importantly, maybe not all of them, but some of them starting to seeing that might be okay to to invest in the companies in manufacturing space, and it's a long-term game. It's because there's maybe other fields where it's in the short time you can get some you can get some gains, like much faster, but in manufacturing it's always long, maybe longer than the other than other fields. And it looks like there's maybe some specific cohort of the VCs that are okay with that. They're okay with the longer cycles. They're okay with the long-term strategy, with long-term everything. And they okay with companies that, yes, they might not, exit it within like 5-7 years, but instead in 15 years. I don't know, 20 or not, but in 15 years or something like that. I definitely did see that among private equity, but again, that's a different animal, so they have different everything. But also, I've seen that among some VCs that they finally focused on manufacturing, and so they looking for the companies that of course in this space they specialized in this space. It's very narrow, very niche, and but again, 10 years ago it wasn't the case at all, even 5 maybe, but now it's changing. And I don't know what's role of AI here. Is it play too big role in that or not, or is it necessary to have this AI component in the mix of manufacturing company or not? So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the phrase you said earlier, just digital transformation, is enough. Like, I think there's all of a sudden the realization that manufacturing had to digitize, for America to be globally competitive. Like, America's manufacturers had to digitize. So that's like, just massive upside, massive. And just a land grab. And you see that in the procurement space right now, just like how many, like the sheer volume of procurement companies like now coming out, like just all up and down the supply chain trying to digitize absolutely every nook and cranny of it. So I think that's one. I think AI, is very critical in this because it represents labor and the intersection of software and labor. So like if you think about the problem of purchasing that we talk about, that is a labor-specific, focus. A person must purchase a thing. And as a result, there's indirect overhead over that person that is purchasing that thing, which is a people thing. And so if you start to introduce software that acts positionally to that, then time and the time value of money start to, rapidly, uncouple, and, you start to see savings and, then growth as a result. So I think when you look at manufacturing at large and how, the question you asked about, does AI play a role with it? I think absolutely, because manufacturing is inherently been approached as a labor market more than anything. And now, things like tribal knowledge. Tribal knowledge can be discussed in terms of AI. You think about engineering problems. Now you can rapidly scale one person to do a lot of great things because you can have assistance on the engineering problem. But I think, all of it comes together. It's just it has to happen. Software has to happen. Advancements in hardware has to happen. And then when you mix it just with the heat of there's not enough people in these markets, to keep them growing at their current rate, Then you have the perfect Venn diagram and quad diagram and all the calculus in between to say that like this is the most massive untapped like market for digitization, period. And so that creates like I think a fever pitch and a land grab. Then all of a sudden, the same way that like, every other verticalized software application that we've ever seen, banking, finance, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Like, and all of a sudden you have an even much larger contributor, potential contributor, just because of the labor function. Like, hell yeah. Like it starts to become finally a no-brainer. And then you see that like thankful rates in software and like the unbundling of like the monolithic apps like the SAPs and, like all the other, ERP companies that like have just been so, pervading through the market as the only software that we use, or like CAD is the only software that we use. But now you've got this interstitial stuff. And like, then how do you like, get all this interstitial stuff to work together? Well, there's only like logical means of like, bringing in AI and like machine learned like applications to be able to like communicate across. And so it's just like, it just compounds and just becomes massive. And the more of that flywheel starts to turn, the more capital starts to come in it and the more it starts to spin it out. And I think, if we look at the past 10 years, like there's been enough success stories like in these applications that where people are like, I mean, just like, today with Zip, a procurement company, just announced a pretty massive Series C or D, I can't remember. But it's just like nobody would have thought of like a startup in procurement, to be like a couple $1 billion company like in just a few years. And like, here they are. So, and that is very much on the heels of like AI bringing massive efficiencies to the digitization efforts.
Yeah, it looks like we are entering the sort of the time when software companies starting to play nicely with each other in manufacturing. So it's, as you said, it's not just one monolithic like ERP system, SAP kind of a system that pretty much manage like a whole shop. And again, it's still a question: is it good for the shop or not, or many perspective? But instead, it's a number of the tools that help you on the productivity level, on automation level, in the different fields, and probably will save you not only some time but some money as well, because again, you can just do more with less. With less everything, with less with less people, with less money involved, and things like that. So you mentioned one of the things that I want to touch on is procurement. I mean, obviously it was always the case that if machine shop want to work with pretty much any large company, I don't know, like Boeing, Lockheed, whatever. So it's everything always goes through the procurement system. And they basically monopolized everything, like for good or bad. So do you think it's changing too? Is it like basically the new procurement system, appearing on the market, or it's something else happening in this field?
No, I think it's definitely changing. The same way, that all the quoting platforms changed the act of manufacturing and machining, it just opens up options. So I think the other thing that we've seen in the past 10 years is with the inbound demand is the inbound need to find more and more lower tiers to produce the things. So people have like opened up, and I mean that in a positive way, bigly opened up the new vendor path. Questions like how do we very quickly verify a vendor, or how do we test a vendor? How do we like get them in our system? How do we like start to produce? Like nobody 10 years ago, the big question that we always got with MakeTime and Xometry was just like, well, we don't know those vendors. And then our answer was, do you need to? Like if we're like verifying and validating and we're going to, cover this stuff. So I think there's a whole new chapter. And, this is one of the things that we do is vendor discovery. Yeah. Like, it's just like, like how do you say somebody's good? How do you validate them? What are all the things? Because once again, it's just like, when you've got the amount of demand that's coming down on the United States now and potentially growing, you don't want to be in the position of saying no again. But this time to the vendor side. Before, we said it to the demand side. And so now we have to open up this pathway. And so technology is coming at it. And, AI in particular is being a good sport here in terms of like, what is the rubric for a good supplier? Like, don't we have enough information? Like, isn't there enough available financial like performance and like verifiable social information on if a place is going to just like take your money and run, like, or if they're going to just like be in the business of creating crap parts. Like there's pretty much anybody that makes bad parts doesn't really make it. So it's just like, you know, a matter of monitoring those things. So, but I do think it's, and the more I think about it, it's the inverse problem that we saw in the last 10 years, which is it is an utter supply and supply verification problem now. And there are like great companies up and down the chain doing stuff like from, you know, fair markets to Scout Bees to the, you know, Light Source to like, you name it. There's just a lot of, and the thing is, back to your like playing nice kind of thing, because there's an infinite market. Like purchasing, like in the United States, an MRO is a $595 billion market. I think there's enough, you know, and like when you think about like all like, you know, capital goods, like on the manufacturing side, like once again, we're back at $1 trillion. It's like there's enough businesses. There's like 400,000 plus businesses like to spread this stuff around. And like the more quickly we all do this, the more we all coalesce and start to chip at the market together, the more like that we all succeed. We have to. Like the market, like it's just like I'll never forget when I was getting my like master's education in competition with Xometry at MakeTime, and like just like the sheer amount of money that it takes to educate the manufacturing communities that they need software. It's not a trivial amount of money, right? And that's venture money that is like very well used in that case to be able to soften these markets. And so it's definitely, it's like super exciting. Procurement is like both the most boring and like it's just like the pedantic side of all this stuff, if that's even the right word. Like it's just like, you know, these people have a rubric that they're going to say whether or not you're going to get this part or not, or whether or not you're going to sell wrenches to this company. And our argument is like, these are all college educated people in these positions that probably have a lot more value add somewhere else to think strategically than just to be like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And it's like, it just becomes like a big, you know, conveyor belt of just like garbage conversations that I don't think anybody, like one of the funniest things, I always forget what the statistic is, but purchasing and procurement and within supply chain has the highest attrition rate of any position because just nobody really wants the job.
Yeah.
Because it's rules based and like, and you're just doing the function. So, you know, the same way that like once you ease up quoting in a manufacturing environment, like how much more can the owner and like the head engineers now do? It's the same thing. Like once you like open up like vendor qualification or like the process for this stuff, how much more capacity is there to do like absolutely amazing things with that same brain power, right? It's just like moving like that kind of that capital to where it's most needed, like forecasting, strategy, and all the good stuff.
Yeah, I think it's super exciting because it all looks like it's finally we see this puzzle sort of coming together because, like you mentioned, this verification of the supplier, which is one of the function of the procurement system, and I mean, there's obvious ways to digitize it, right? So it should be digital, and this actually brings me to some other questions. So again, by talking to some other shops that not, let's call them, they are not public, meaning that there's not a lot of the information about them publicly in the internet, LinkedIn, websites, nothing like that. So, I mean, it looks like that in the future, and I'm talking about next couple of years, it's going to be necessary to have your machine shop manufacturer online entirely, everything online, just to be, so the other parties, your buyer can actually verify that you're legit and you have, you have certain quality operations, and of course, from the financial perspective as well. So you have like, I don't know, like digital connecting through plate to the bank or stuff like that, whatever. But it looks like you would have to be digitized to be able to work with I don't know, maybe even with the biggest company as well, because you
Yeah.
want to be verified, but you need to be digital, you need to be online. So do you think it's what's happening?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like it's as real as in IRL. It's just like if you're not, I feel like I'm speaking like a 1950 person. Like if you're not online, then you're not going anywhere. But no, you're right. No, you have to, and I think you have to, and I think certifications are coming online too, like where you can be verified, like in all the stuff that's necessary to do business. So I mean, just why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think everything is awesome that's happening now, and I'm glad that I kind of can bounce some of the things from you, like just to confirm, like it's actually happening. It's not only just in my imagination, in my brain, and also like yes, across our customers. But again, I bias to like the best customers that really like digitalize their shop. So just again, so that's something that I really glad I were able to confirm.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, so very cool. Thank you so much, Dura. It
You
was a
got it,
pleasure
man.
as always. Yeah,
And
alrighty.
yeah, stay in touch. I'm just a phone call away.
Absolutely. Cool. Thank you so
All
much.
right.
All right.
We'll
Bye-bye.
see you. Bye.
See you.